What would you do if the person you trusted the most betrayed you in the most unimaginable way? A close friend, someone you considered family, impregnating your 13-year-old daughter. Would you seek justice, or would something darker take hold of you? This story is a chilling reminder of how betrayal can ignite violence and shatter everything in its path. In this gripping tale, a lifetime of friendship gives way to a tragic betrayal, leading to a brutal act that no one saw coming. Secrets long buried are exposed, and revenge becomes the only option. But at what cost? Before we dive into this devastating story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to Crime Chronicles for more shocking tales of betrayal and violence that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Tyrone, Ty Johnson and Marcus Williams shared a bond forged in the tough streets of their neighborhood, a bond that had withstood the test of time. Ty, at just 28, had lived a life of hardship since he was an orphan, raised by his strict but caring uncle. Life had dealt him a tough hand, and to survive, he dove into the world of hustling. Selling drugs became his way of life, bringing in quick money but also a constant sense of danger. Ty's life was full of uncertainty, but he made sure to shield his friends from the harsh realities of his work, presenting himself as someone they could rely on despite the dark undertones of his life. On the other hand, Marcus, 2 years older than Ty, had a much different path. Raised in a stable home, he continued his father's mechanic business after his father passed away. He had inherited not just the family trade, but the trust and respect that came with it in their community. Marcus built a comfortable life with his wife and daughter, a life far removed from Ty's volatile world. But despite their vastly different lifestyles, Marcus and Ty remained inseparable. Ty had been a constant presence in Marcus's life since childhood, often referring to him as a brother. He would visit Marcus's home frequently, bringing gifts and supporting Marcus's family as if they were his own. Ty was close to Marcus's daughter, Jasmine, who saw him as a trusted uncle. While Marcus worked tirelessly at the garage, Ty would often come by to help out, or just to hang around, catching up on life and offering Marcus some extra cash whenever bills got tight. Ty's loyalty to Marcus was unwavering, and it was reciprocated in kind. Despite their differences, Ty's shady dealings and Marcus's straightforward life, their friendship was a model of brotherhood, built on mutual respect and shared memories from growing up together in the same rough neighborhood. Their bond grew even stronger over time, with both families intertwined by the connection between Ty and Marcus. Yet, behind the surface of their seemingly perfect friendship, Ty's hidden world was one Marcus knew little about. It was a world that would eventually collide with Marcus's family in a way that no one could have predicted. Marcus's family was everything to him. His wife, Delilah, was a loving woman who balanced raising their daughter while supporting Marcus in every way she could. Their daughter, Jasmine, was growing into a beautiful young girl. At 13, she was the pride of Marcus and Delilah, mature for her age and a promising student with a bright future. Jasmine, like many girls her age, had her moments of rebellion but always respected the foundation of love and discipline her parents provided. She was no stranger to the tough realities of their neighborhood, but her family kept her sheltered from the worst of it, giving her a sense of safety that allowed her to grow into a confident, independent young girl. Ty, Marcus's lifelong friend, was a constant figure in their lives. He wasn't just a family friend, he was an uncle, in the truest sense of the word. Ty was always at the Williams home, whether it was helping Marcus with car repairs or simply hanging out in the living room. He gave Jasmine advice, played games with her, and even bought her little gifts. There was never any question of Ty's place in their lives, he was family, and Marcus trusted him without a second thought. But as the months passed, something began to shift, something Marcus couldn't see. Jasmine, with her innocent charm and quickly maturing beauty, began to draw Ty's attention in ways that felt more intense, more personal. At first, it was subtle, lingering glances, a hand resting a little too long on her shoulder, a comment here or there about how pretty she looked, which, at first, seemed harmless. But as time went on, those comments started to linger in the air, and Jasmine, in her naivety, began to notice Ty's gaze was no longer one of an affectionate uncle, but something more intense. Ty's internal conflict raged within him, but he couldn't escape the pull. He knew it was wrong, knew he should never feel this way about his best friend's daughter, a girl he had known since she was little. But as she grew older, as she began to mature into the woman she was becoming, Ty couldn't help but admire the beauty that blossomed before him. He told himself it was just a fleeting attraction, something he could control, but each visit, each moment spent alone with Jasmine, made it harder to deny. One afternoon, when Marcus and Delilah were both busy with their respective lives, Marcus at the shop and Delilah running errands, Ty came by for one of his usual visits. Jasmine was home alone, a quiet afternoon, and Ty, on impulse, stopped by to check in on her. He had no plan to stay long, but the moment he walked in, everything shifted. There was something different about the way she looked at him that day, something vulnerable. She didn't seem like the little girl he once knew. They talked for a while, with Jasmine asking him about his day and casually offering him a drink. Ty, feeling a rush of warmth in her presence, sat down on the couch beside her. For a moment, everything felt normal again, like the comfortable family friend he always had been. But then, as Jasmine stood to get him a glass of water, the way her clothes hugged her body, the way she moved, Ty felt his breath catch in his throat. As she returned with the water, the atmosphere shifted. He couldn't ignore it any longer, he wanted her. The struggle inside him was fierce, but the temptation was too much. Ty, in a haze of lust and confusion, crossed the line. He grabbed her arm before she could sit down, his touch urgent and almost violent in its desperation. Jasmine froze, startled by his actions. She tried to push him off, but Ty was too strong, too determined, and in an instant, the man she trusted, the man who had been like family, took what he wanted. The horror of the moment settled in as Jasmine sobbed in disbelief. She could barely comprehend what had just happened, and Ty, overwhelmed by regret but still gripped by his own demons, begged her not to tell anyone. His voice, shaking with guilt, pleaded with her to keep it a secret. The remorse he felt for his actions quickly turned to anger as Jasmine's crying became too much for him to bear. Fear crept into his mind, he knew the gravity of his crime, and the last thing he wanted was to lose everything. With shaking hands, he pulled a gun from his waistband, holding it up to her tear-streaked face, his voice low and threatening. "If you tell anyone, I'll make sure you regret it. I'll kill your parents in front of you, then I'll kill you," he spat. "I swear, I'll do it." Jasmine, paralyzed with fear, nodded silently, agreeing to keep the secret to protect her family. She couldn't bring herself to speak, terrified of the consequences if she did. She had trusted him. Now, that trust had shattered into a million pieces, leaving her vulnerable, broken, and alone with a devastating secret. Ty, feeling the weight of his actions, left the house quickly, a mixture of shame and guilt weighing on him. Jasmine sat in the silence of the house, the weight of what had happened pressing down on her chest. It felt like the world was closing in on her, but she kept quiet, convincing herself she had no other choice. However, deep inside, she knew that something needed to change before it was too late. Jasmine tried to go on with her life, but the weight of the secret she carried was suffocating. Each day, she felt the heavy burden of her silence growing more unbearable, but the threat Ty had made loomed over her like a dark cloud. She couldn't tell anyone, not her parents, not even her closest friends. The shame, the betrayal, and the fear of what Ty would do to her family if she spoke kept her silent. But as the days went by, something inside her body began to change, and with it, so did the terror that plagued her. The first sign came when Jasmine started to feel nauseous more often than usual, but she dismissed it at first. She told herself it was just stress, maybe a passing illness. But then, her body began to shift in ways that were impossible to ignore. Her clothes no longer fit as they once had, and her stomach began to show the first signs of what was happening. She didn't know what to do or who to turn to. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw a reminder of the trauma she was trying to bury. The growing life inside her was a constant reminder of the betrayal and horror that had happened at the hands of the man who was supposed to be family. Jasmine's mother, Delilah, had noticed the subtle changes in her daughter. She had always been close to Jasmine, and though she could see her daughter was becoming more withdrawn, Delilah chalked it up to the stress of growing up. But the signs of pregnancy didn't go unnoticed. Delilah began to ask subtle questions, and Jasmine's quiet, defensive responses only fueled her suspicions. She noticed the way Jasmine avoided certain foods, how she seemed unusually fatigued, and how she seemed to be withdrawing from her once normal routine. One evening, Delilah couldn't take the uncertainty any longer. She sat Jasmine down in the kitchen, her voice gentle but firm. "Jasmine, I need you to tell me the truth. Something's wrong. You can't hide from me forever." Jasmine looked at her mother, the tears welling up in her eyes, but she stayed silent. She couldn't bring herself to speak. She couldn't tell her mother the truth, not after everything Ty had threatened her with. The guilt gnawed at her insides, but the fear was stronger. She had no idea how to tell her mother that the man they had all trusted, the one they had called family, was the reason she was in this situation. Delilah's patience wore thin as the days passed, and one afternoon, she finally took matters into her own hands. She bought a pregnancy test, watching Jasmine closely as she hesitated in the bathroom. It wasn't an accusation, just a mother's instinct. The test was simple, but the result hit both of them like a wrecking ball. It confirmed Delilah's worst nightmare. Jasmine was pregnant. Delilah's heart sank. She hadn't expected it. She rushed to Jasmine, holding her tightly, but there was no comfort in her daughter's arms. Jasmine's body was trembling, her face pale as she struggled to speak. Delilah's eyes searched her daughter's face for some explanation, some sign of what had happened. "Who did this to you, Jasmine?" Delilah asked, her voice quiet but full of fear and disbelief. The silence in the room was deafening, and for a long moment, Jasmine couldn't bring herself to say anything. The fear of Ty's threats, the weight of the shame, it all suffocated her. But in the end, the truth spilled out in a flood of tears. "Uncle Ty," she whispered, barely audible, her voice thick with pain. "It was him. He did it." Delilah's face drained of color. It felt as if the floor had dropped from beneath her feet. The man they had all trusted, Ty, the man who had been like family, had assaulted her daughter and left her pregnant. It felt like a sick joke, something too impossible to comprehend, but the truth hit her hard. Her mind raced, and her body felt numb as her heart shattered in pieces. How could this have happened? How could the man who had showered their family with gifts and kindness betray them in the most unimaginable way? Delilah's fury was immediate, but the pain and heartbreak were more overwhelming than anything she had ever felt. She hugged Jasmine tightly, trying to comfort her, but she was also thinking, planning, wondering what to do next. She couldn't let this go. She couldn't let Ty get away with what he had done. When Marcus came home that evening, he immediately sensed that something was wrong. Delilah's face was pale, and Jasmine was visibly shaken, her tears still fresh on her cheeks. Delilah didn't hesitate. She told him everything, the pregnancy test, Jasmine's confession, and the horror of what Ty had done. Marcus's world seemed to tilt on its axis. His best friend, his brother, had violated the one thing he trusted him with most, his family. The rage that flooded Marcus was all-consuming. His heart pounded with a mixture of disbelief, betrayal, and intense anger. He couldn't fathom it. His best friend had taken advantage of his daughter, destroyed her innocence, and shattered the trust they had built over a lifetime. Marcus's mind raced, and all he could think about was how to make Ty pay for what he had done. Marcus's first instinct was to get the police involved, to bring Ty to justice, but a deeper, darker part of him rose up, something primal. He thought of Jasmine's tears, her pain, and his own shattered trust. He knew that this wasn't something he could let go, not without facing Ty, not without making him pay for the devastation he had caused. The anger inside him swelled into something more dangerous. He was a man who could no longer sit idly by. He had to act, and the act of revenge would come soon enough. As the anger built within him, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to wait for the justice system. He would make Ty pay, and he would do it in his own way. Marcus's emotions spiraled into an uncontrollable storm of rage and disbelief. His hands shook as he paced through the house, his thoughts racing faster than his heart could keep up. His daughter, the one person he had promised to protect above all else, had been violated by the man he considered a brother. How could Ty, a man who had been part of his life for years, the one who had been there through thick and thin, betray him so cruelly? The anger that boiled inside him was like fire, scorching everything in its path. Without thinking, Marcus went to the small closet where he kept his gun, his fingers wrapping around the cold steel of the weapon. It was the same gun he had kept hidden away for emergencies in the violent neighborhood they lived in, but this wasn't an emergency, it was something far worse. He had to confront Ty. He couldn't just sit back and let the system decide what to do with the man who had destroyed his family. No, he was going to make sure Ty paid for what he had done. His steps were heavy as he walked out of his house, his mind clouded with fury and the image of Jasmine's tear-streaked face fresh in his mind. He barely registered the sounds of his wife calling after him, asking where he was going. Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. His only focus was Ty. He had to make sure that man knew the full weight of his betrayal. The short walk to Ty's house felt like an eternity. Every step was laden with the weight of his decision, but Marcus didn't falter. He had made up his mind. When he reached Ty's front door, his hand trembled slightly as he knocked, but only out of sheer adrenaline. The anger was so intense, it drowned out everything else. Moments passed before the door creaked open, and there stood Ty, his familiar face, that smile of someone who had never thought they would face a consequence for their actions. Ty looked at Marcus, his eyes momentarily flashing with confusion, but that confusion quickly morphed into a defensive wariness. He had no idea what was coming. "Marcus, man, what's going on?" he asked, his voice casual, almost like it was just another visit. Marcus didn't waste words. His hand moved faster than Ty could react, and the gun was in his face. Ty froze, his eyes widening in shock. The blood drained from his face as he realized the gravity of the situation, but still, he didn't speak. His body language told Marcus everything he needed to know. Ty knew what he had done, and now he was facing the consequences. "You destroyed my family, Ty." Marcus's voice was a low growl, filled with raw emotion. "You broke something in me that'll never be fixed." Ty took a step back, his hands rising in a defensive gesture, but Marcus wasn't listening. He couldn't. The anger that had been simmering inside him for days now erupted, and in that moment, Marcus was no longer the man he had been. His hand tightened around the gun, and without a second thought, he pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, a deafening sound that sent a jolt through the air, and Ty staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock. He never had a chance to say a word. Another shot. And another. The sounds of the gunfire echoed down the street as Ty crumpled to the floor, his body limp and motionless, the life drained from him in mere seconds. Marcus stood over him, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath, the weight of his actions starting to settle in. But even then, his anger didn't dissipate. It was too deep, too raw, to be silenced by the aftermath of what he had done. Neighbors who had heard the shots rushed to their windows, their faces filled with horror as they watched the chaos unfold. One woman, still in her pajamas, rushed to her phone and dialed 911. The call was frantic, filled with panic. "There's been a shooting. I think someone's dead," she screamed into the receiver. The dispatcher's calm voice was barely audible over the chaos, but the urgency was clear: the police were on their way. Marcus, his body still shaking with adrenaline, took one last look at the man he had once called his brother. A deep sense of regret started to sink in, but it was too late to turn back now. He had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Without another word, he turned and walked away from the scene, the gun still clutched tightly in his hand. By the time the authorities arrived, the street was already buzzing with the news. The flashing lights of the police cars lit up the neighborhood, and the sounds of sirens filled the air. Marcus had left the scene by then, disappearing into the night, but his actions had already been seen. Neighbors had witnessed the shooting and had no doubt who was responsible. The police, upon arriving at Ty's house, found his lifeless body on the floor, a pool of blood surrounding him. The scene was chaotic, the remnants of the gunshots still hanging in the air like a bad omen. As the officers began their investigation, they spoke to the witnesses who had seen Marcus leave the scene, and the connection was undeniable. Within hours, the police were knocking on Marcus's door, their uniforms a stark contrast to the life he had once known. The arrest was swift. There was no denying what he had done. The neighbors had seen him, and the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. Marcus was taken into custody, his wife and daughter watching from the doorway, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and disbelief. The family they had built together was unraveling in front of them, and there was no way to stop it now. As he was led away, his daughter, Jasmine, still struggled to understand everything that had happened. The betrayal, the shooting, the arrest, it was all too much. Marcus had always been their protector, their rock, but now he was the one in handcuffs, leaving them to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The trial was swift, and the courtroom was filled with tension. The prosecution laid out the facts: Marcus had killed Ty in cold blood, driven by rage and betrayal. His actions were undeniable. But the defense had a different angle. They painted Marcus as a man who had been pushed beyond his limits, a father who had found his daughter in the most unimaginable situation. They argued that Marcus's actions, while extreme, were born out of love and a desperate desire to protect his family. The jury deliberated for hours, weighing the evidence and the emotional testimony. In the end, they found Marcus guilty, but they also showed mercy. They recognized the deep emotional turmoil he had been in and the immense pressure he had been under. They saw him as a concerned father, a man who had been driven to his breaking point. And so, despite the severity of the crime, the jury handed down a light sentence. Marcus was sentenced to a reduced term, taking into account his emotional state and the circumstances of the case. While it wasn't a complete acquittal, it was a sentence far lighter than most expected. He would spend some time in prison, but it was clear that the jury believed his actions were motivated by love and a desire to protect his family, not malice or premeditation. The outcome left a bittersweet feeling in the courtroom. While Marcus had been convicted, the justice system had acknowledged the complexity of the situation. For Marcus, however, the real punishment was yet to come. His family would never be the same. The trust that had once bound them together had been shattered, and the pain of betrayal would linger long after the trial ended. As he left the courthouse, the weight of his actions was apparent on his face. He had taken a life to protect his daughter, but in doing so, he had lost everything he held dear. The life he once knew was gone, and there was no turning back. He would spend his days behind bars, but the emotional scars would remain long after he was released. The story of Marcus Williams and his tragic decision would become a cautionary tale, one that highlighted the dangerous consequences of betrayal, the complexities of fatherhood, and the painful choices people are forced to make when pushed to their limits. The aftermath of betrayal is never as simple as a verdict, it's a wound that never truly heals. What do you do when the very people you love become the ones who shatter your world? Marcus's actions, driven by love and rage, forever changed everything he knew. While the courtroom may have offered a measure of justice, it couldn't undo the destruction that followed. The broken trust, the irreversible loss, and the haunting question of whether he did the right thing linger. What would you do if you were in Marcus's shoes? How far would you go to protect your family, even if it meant losing everything you held dear? If this shocking tale left you questioning the limits of love and revenge, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Chronicles for more gripping stories that explore the darkest corners of human nature.